I wanted to start by reflecting on the story of Dontrell Davis. As you can see on the board, I wrote a book that's partly about Cabrini Green and really about Chicago and about America in many ways. On the morning of October 13th, 1992, a school day, Dontrell was on his way to his first grade classroom. He and his mother walked out of their Cabrini Green public housing high-rise. Jenner Elementary was directly across the street. But Danny, as his mother called him, was dragging that morning, asking if he could please stay home from school. The 7-year-old saw his classmates entering the building. There were Cabrini residents in shiny yellow vests working as crossing guards. 2 police officers sat in an idled squad car nearby. At 9 a.m., the school bell sounded. Moments later, 2 gunshots rang out, fired from another high-rise, far away, actually. One of the bullets entered the left side of Dontrell's head. We are a city too often known for its violence. As bad as things have seemed in recent years here, 1992 was, at least statistically, worse. There were 650 homicides in Chicago last year in 2017. In 2016, there were 762. In 1992, there were 943. By many measures, it was the most violent year in Chicago history. Dontrell Davis was the 74th child murdered that year, and tragically, the 3rd student from his elementary school alone. The numbers are harrowing and, as we know, numbing. It's hard to focus on one death when there are so many. Something surprising happened, though. The public outcry over Dontrell Davis's murder didn't stop. Dontrell became the symbol that Emmett Till was, as the Sun-Times declared. The local news ran hundreds, literally hundreds, of stories about him. The national news covered the shooting as well. Think how rare that is. Of the thousands of deaths in Chicago over the past few years, whose name has become a rallying cry for change? Whose name is one that we all know? A couple of young people shot by police officers, probably, Laquan McDonald, Rakia Boyd, but others would be hard-pressed to come up with some. Hadia Pendleton, maybe because she had performed at President Obama's second inauguration a week before she was killed. Most of the Dontrell Davis stories, however, were really less about him than about the demise of public housing and about the infamy of Cabrini Green. A public housing hellhole of poverty and crime, one national news show called it. Another said, now the very name Cabrini is synonymous with what many people fear most about urban America, rage and hopelessness spiraling out of control. Dontrell Davis was proof to many that the 50-year effort of the government to provide housing for the country's neediest had failed. But the reasons for that failure are complicated. Like at other public housing developments, the city seemed to have given up on repairs and maintenance at Cabrini Green. Due to mismanagement and underfunding and indifference, about 40% of the 3,600 units there were vacant. This is at the time of his shooting. The CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, had never fixed them up and readied them again for occupancy. Many cops, along with criminals, had come to treat large public housing developments like Cabrini Green as unpoliced vice zones. But in the name of Dontrell Davis, all the deferred maintenance and attention suddenly arrived at once like something out of a fable. A week after his death, the entire city apparatus seemed to show up at the 70 acres of Cabrini Green. City workers applied fresh coats of paint, filled potholes, repaired electrical wires, fumigated for roaches, replaced lights, towed abandoned cars, nailed plywood over hundreds of vacant units that had remained accessible for years. Mayor Richard M. Daley, in his 3rd year in office of an eventual 22, promised to take down the criminal element at Cabrini Green. We have to have a war here, and we have to go after them the same way they go after innocent people, he said. And so a security force made up of Chicago police, CHA officers, DEA, ATF, and FBI also went floor to floor in all 23 high-rises at Cabrini Green, searching every room of every apartment. Suddenly, at that time, everyone was evoking the name Dontrell Davis, using it to push for big change to come. There was an architectural contest in the Tribune to redesign a better Cabrini Green. A plan was floated to privatize public housing. The CHA said it wanted to consider buying single-family homes in the suburbs and moving residents there. This was 1992 in the fall, and the presidential election was weeks away, and Bill Clinton was here in Chicago stumping at Daley Plaza, and he asked voters to help him oust President George H.W. Bush, saying Bush would never pay for the increase in cops needed to keep Chicago safe. "We owe it to Dontrell Davis," he shouted to cheers. Today, we often hear complaints from outsiders, people usually not from Chicago or not from outlying neighborhoods in Chicago, and they say, why do people only protest when there's a police-involved shooting? Why don't they protest the killings in their own neighborhood? They do, of course. They organize, meet, express outrage, offer support, ask for help, even if much of it goes unreported or unnoticed. I bring that up because after Dontrell Davis's death, residents at Cabrini Green also said enough is enough. At the same time that Mayor Daley was declaring war on the criminal element at Cabrini Green, a local activist named Marion Stamps held a press conference of her own at a little missionary Baptist church on the near north side. She had a 15-point peace plan. Rather than boarding up and demolishing empty high-rises, she wanted buildings repurposed to house an alternative high school, a library, a youth shelter, a drug treatment facility. She demanded that empty apartments be repaired so that those who needed homes could move into them. She asked that the local schools be fully staffed and that the neighborhood receive a food co-op, a movie theater, a bowling alley. Cabrini Green had more people on just 70 acres than many suburbs, and almost none of their services or amenities. Marion Stamps was also part of a group demanding a ceasefire between Chicago's black gangs, the street organizations, she called them. The idea for a truce spread in Chicago. The leaders of the gangs, almost all of them serving long sentences in prison, gave their blessing. Organized crime was one thing, disorganized crime something else entirely. They had to demonstrate that they could impose order on a city that more frequently seemed without any. At the end of October, 3 weeks after Dontrell's killing, an actual treaty was signed at a community center at Cabrini Green. Leaders from every black gang were represented, the Vice Lords, El Rookins, Gangster Disciples, Black Gangster Disciples, Cobra Stones, among others. Anyone who broke the treaty would be violated by members of their own gang, and they would have to answer for their crimes behind the prison walls. What's amazing is that this seemed to work. In November, so this is a month after Dontrell Davis's shooting, no shootings occurred at Cabrini Green. There were 0 in December. For 8 months, so even outside the winter months, Cabrini Green saw just 1 shooting and no homicides. Citywide, the year-to-year homicide numbers dropped only slightly. The truce included just the black gangs, not white gangs, Latino gangs, and there was also violence that happened all the time that had nothing to do with gang warfare, gangs. The city, at least officially, didn't want to give any credit to the truce. They sell drugs, Daley said. That's not a gang truce. They sell weapons. They extort money from merchants. They threaten people. Forget about it. An officer I interviewed who worked at Cabrini Green said he was told by his superiors to keep the truce going as long as possible, no matter what. Kids were outside jumping rope. People weren't scanning the upper floors of the high-rises for snipers. Little League games were being played between children from the different housing developments. But this officer regretted not using the relative calm to do something more lasting, to lure in employers, job training, drug programs, GED classes. Ultimately, he told me, it failed. The frenzy of activity after Dontrell Davis's death also sparked several redevelopment plans for Cabrini Green. First, a plan to knock down 3 towers, which was expanded to 8 towers, and ultimately, I'd argue, his death led to the plan for transformation. The effort launched in 2000 by Mayor Daley that would demolish every public housing high-rise in Chicago for families, which is where we are now. Before Dontrell Davis, the idea of tearing down public housing was considered a political and practical impossibility. Politically, it seemed like career suicide to support an effort to displace tens of thousands low-income African Americans. Practically, there was nowhere to put all those people. In the past, when neighborhoods were razed for urban renewal, the displaced were dumped into public housing. Plus, public housing residents had been demonized for decades, so they were feared, and no community was willing to welcome them. That demonization continues today, of course. Spikes in gun violence are still being blamed on high-rise residents. Many of you have probably heard this before. That's nearly a decade after the last high-rise was shuttered, that people are still being blamed. Dontrell Davis created a bit of a consensus in Chicago around demolition, however. Now is the time to start tearing down the Chicago Housing Authority high-rises, declared an editorial in the Tribune. Now, while the memory of Dontrell Davis, shot dead at Cabrini Green on his way to grade school, still burns our civic memory. In a survey conducted by the Defender, 2/3 of the respondents thought Cabrini Green should be destroyed. Cabrini Green did, in fact, need to be safer and more livable, like many public housing high-rise developments in the city, and maybe even replaced entirely with something better. But acting out of fear, spurred on by a moral panic, it almost guaranteed that those who lived there would lose out with whatever succeeded it. Looking beyond the Dontrell Davis memorials to see the underlying problems that cause the current conditions in the city's public housing, the segregated site placement, the overabundance of children, the mismanagement and poor maintenance, the deficits and declining fortunes of cities, the loss of nearby jobs and the departure of working families, the gangs and drugs and the stigma. Seeing any of that had become nearly impossible. Fewer and fewer Americans believed that they had a collective responsibility to provide enough for those who had too little. Most serious debate about inner city social services and housing subsidies gave way to tough talk of police, prisons, and demolition. Most families relocated from public housing, as many of you may know, moved into segregated neighborhoods on the south and west sides, into communities that were also racked by poverty and violence. I've been thinking a lot lately of a quote I just read from a historian named Michael Katz. Public policy is made on self-interest and sold on myth. It seems appropriate. I want to end by returning to the question of why Dontrell Davis. Why did his death lead to a sustained public outcry when hundreds, when thousands of others didn't? It's a question that I think is relevant for any action we consider today. Some of the reason, for sure, had to do with the circumstances of his death. Dontrell Davis's youth, the nearby school, his mother just within arm's distance. Much of it also had to do with Cabrini Green's reputation, its symbolism. To give context of how Cabrini Green was perceived at that time, you guys may know the horror movie Candyman. It's about the hook-handed apparition that is, if you say his name 5 times, he'll appear. In the movie, he resides in a block of abandoned Cabrini Green apartments. That movie premiered the night before Dontrell Davis's death at a theater actually just a few blocks from Cabrini Green. But there's another reason for the reaction to Dontrell Davis's death that I think is very important for today. After decades of inner-city decline in Chicago, after white flight and the loss of hundreds of thousands of city residents and the disappearance of much of its manufacturing base, Chicago was beginning to thrive again in 1992, at least near the city center. The city's population ticked up in 1990 for the first time in 40 years. Around Cabrini Green, just blocks away from here, there were hundreds of millions of dollars worth of new construction and upgrades. River North had recently formed as a neighborhood, as a new creative and residential community. Lincoln Park and Old Town were flourishing. Thousands of new white residents moved into the surrounding blocks. This was the beginning of the urban renaissance that we are now living in. You can look out these windows and see it around us. Think about that change that we're all a part of, that we're all experiencing. It's pretty incredible, this change in Chicago. For much of the 20th century, inner city was a pejorative, a bad word. It meant danger, scary place, often black or Latino place. Cabrini Green was the very embodiment of that notion. Now inner city means wealth. It means a place few can afford and most cannot afford. That's true in Chicago, and it's true in nearly every other major metropolitan area. For the first time in the nation's history, we have more impoverished people living in suburbs than in cities. We still think of suburban poverty as an oxymoron, but it's the fact of the world in which we now live. Today, in large part because of this urban renaissance, we are in an affordable housing crisis that seems as urgent as the one in the 1930s and the 1940s, when public housing was first devised. Right now, only 1 of every 5 families poor enough to qualify for any sort of housing subsidy actually receives one. That means 80% of our poorest families get nothing and are on their own. Housing is the greatest expense for most people, probably for most of us in this room. Paying less than 30% of your income in rent is thought of as the threshold before rent starts eating into other necessities such as money for food and health care and education. Half of all renters in the country now pay at least 30% of their income in rent, and incredibly, a quarter of us pay at least half of our income in rent. In 2014 in Chicago, the CHA opened up a lottery just to get on a waiting list for a voucher for a public housing unit, or a waiting list for a voucher or a public housing unit, 280,000 families applied. It's incredible to think about that this was for housing that for so long was thought of as the last resort. And yet, basically 1 in 4 families in Chicago applied. We only have 1 million families in Chicago, about 2.7 million people. Saying all this, I'm actually kind of hopeful at this moment. In the 2016 presidential election, even Bernie Sanders, running as a Democratic socialist, he didn't talk about low-income housing, not once. Things have gotten so bad, however, that there is suddenly a discussion going on. Suddenly people are talking about affordable housing in a way they haven't in years, in decades. Stories about public housing and low-income housing are appearing regularly in the news. Rahm Emanuel, our mayor, recently announced the recreation or the starting again of a Department of Housing. It feels like there's political pressure to do something. With an election coming up, he's aware that it's a hot-button issue. The same is true in New York, where the city's 400,000 units of public housing are in extreme disrepair, and in cities across the country struggling with their identities, the identity of who can actually afford to live there. That attention on this issue means there's space for a bigger ask, for us to ask something bigger as far as affordable housing. There's an opportunity, at least, to set a kind of outer boundary of the debate. How can cities actually meet the demand for low-income housing? What would that look like? I'm saying that not just rhetorically. I actually don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm not sure. It's not close-cropped, super-block public housing the way Cabrini Green was. We don't have 23 towers like that built together. But I also don't think it's just relying on the private market and on public-private partnerships. That's not enough. This issue of affordable housing, of low-income housing, of public housing, it's tied to everything. It's tied to public safety, to mental health, to our schools, to transportation, to private enterprise, the role of government, our values. In many ways, it's, that combination of things is why I wrote this book. Everything is wrapped up in it. I think I'll finish by saying about this ask, in the name of Dontrell Davis, as was said so many times before, let's demand more. Let's think of a bigger ask. Thank you. I'm sure many people have heard this too. I mean, so police officers, community groups, I've reported in Rockford, Illinois, and they're still saying there that violence has to do with Chicago residents from CHA housing. That we've had spikes of gun violence in the last several years. One thing that I think is true, there have been many studies to explore this. The Urban Institute has looked into it, newspapers have looked into it. There isn't a correlation between where actual high-rise residents moved and spikes in crime. Now, one thing that we do see is we have large numbers of voucher residents pooling in certain neighborhoods. So I grew up in South Shore. It has the largest share of Section 8 voucher families, or percentage-wise. But I think partly what people are saying there is just poor people. So there's still this stigma of public housing, and that those people, they don't know how to live. They don't, they weren't taught. I mean, I hear this all the time. But many Section 8 vouchers holders have nothing to do with high-rise public housing. Like I said, the last tower came down almost a decade ago in 2011, most of them well before that. So we're thinking like 2005, 2006. This stigma lives on. We have such an uneasiness with poverty. And in our city and also in many places across the country, that's often conflated with race. We also have a huge uneasiness with race, and so the two seem combined. I was talking to a police officer friend just the other day who I'm known for my entire life, who was saying just this argument that in the drug arrests he's made that this has to do with high-rise residents, even though those people, most of them, the people he's talking about weren't even alive, some of them, or they were, infants when the high rises were up.
I was following you all the way until the end.
Okay.
You asked the part about the past. And the past is about, my understanding was the ability to provide housing for low-income people.
Yeah.
So what about asking, how do we provide more opportunities for more people to get out of being low income? Because when we were talking about the historical context, there was, factories and people making
Sure.
living wage just working. And they didn't, college degree or anything. You could work a job and take care of your family and have a house.
I mean, you're certainly right. When I think about this amazing history of Cabrini Green, this area just, we're talking 8 blocks away from here, it was chock full of factories. When you think of every product we use that is now made in China, everything was made just here. Anything you could think of. And so there were those kinds of jobs. So we're not going to solve everything at once. We know that we have a school system that needs to be much better. We know that we need to have all sorts of jobs. We need to have a living wage. Housing is foundational. If you don't have a home, you can't really do any of that. And when you think about sort of just us living in the richest country in the world, that we can't figure out a way that's part of our reimagining of place. When I think about like a bigger ask, so I was saying that only 20% of the people who qualify for affordable housing, any sort of subsidy, receive one. Like imagining what would 5 times the investment be, so that if we fully funded the demand, like what would that look like? What would it look like in terms of actual buildings, units? Would we want 20% of the units in a building like that? Would we want something separate, an individual tower? Are we thinking about only Section 8 vouchers? I think it's also part of how we imagine communities. When we're rethinking areas and we're thinking even public safety, mental health, healthcare, we could think about these things together. You know, a neighborhood like Pullman, where there are new factories, there was also affordable housing as part of this whole model of putting it together. It'd be nice if we were able to plan that way, if resources were going into thinking about how all these pieces fit together.
I think we have time for one more. I'll get the microphone to you.
I like the premise that you said, that you stand in front of sacred communities. Can you speak to the fact that communities who have more home ownership tend to have less violence? One.
Have less what, I'm sorry?
Less violence.
Yeah.
It seems that as home ownership goes up, violence goes down. And if that's the premise that we're presenting, in agreement with my colleague to my left, is that we need to promote more home ownership as violence prevention. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I'll actually push back on that. I think we sort of give privilege to home ownership in this country in a way that's absurd. Like we value it above all else. And you know, we still sort of hold to some idea of like the log cabin and the self-made man, and that so much so that we give basically public housing to every homeowner. You know, there is maybe 3 times more money that goes to the mortgage interest deduction than the entire budget of HUD, of Housing and Urban Development. So if you own a home, you're getting some kind of like public housing for homeowners. That sense of, you know, how that you know, you could think of how that money could also be more equitably distributed. So there are arguments, sure, like if you're a homeowner, you have more investment in a community. You also start to hold on to things like NIMBYism, where you become much less open-minded to how you share that space, and you start saying, you know, we can't have basketball hoops in the park, and you know, there's a segment of a building is going to have 10% low-income housing, and you refuse to have that. So I think it's also a problem, and I think it's somehow we've come to value that above a sort of a shared experience too much. One more question. Sure. How you doing?
So it was certainly, I mean, you're an expert in this field, and I think you said you don't really have a solution or a suggestion on how to solve the problem. Are there any models in the United States that work? If not, can you suggest one? Not only suggest one, but for Chicago, suggest how we get it enacted?
Well, I mean, you know, to say I don't have any suggestions, I mean, we're pushing against the tide. You know, part of the history of public housing is also a history of our thoughts on the social safety net, and an aversion to it, sort of like deeply, you know, seated not just on the extreme of one political party, but in the mainstream. You know, I talk about Bill Clinton in this talk, suddenly, you know, asking for more police, but he's also pushing to sort of gut HUD during his presidency. I mean, and he cuts welfare as we know it. So I think we're swimming against the tide, and we also have an administration in Washington now that is even more so, you know, sort of vilifying the idea of social safety net. Part of that is, like, you know, I said before, you can sort of conflate that with race, and it sort of, you know, stokes up fears and of undeserving people. So that makes it difficult. What would a bigger ask be? But I think there are lots of programs going on. Excuse me. I mean, so we've rapidly expanded the voucher program, and we both have buildings that are built where they're filled. Every unit has to be filled by a voucher, and then also that travel with an individual. That's not necessarily bad. In Chicago, it's been used so, you know, it hasn't desegregated the city. It actually sort of has kept segregation going, but it doesn't have to. And it's difficult to monitor, it's difficult to oversee, but that's a task that I think we could be up to. I'll say just, I think about something like this often too. When I talk about, the mismanagement of Cabrini Green, I'm also saying, that government failed. And that's a difficult thing to talk about because I'm also saying I want government to do more. But we often think about business failing. We are only 10 years out of the worst financial crisis of all of our lifetimes. And we're suddenly, gung-ho to sort of hand the reins back over to businesses. So we don't sort of dismiss them for the rest of their existence. So I think part of it is also thinking imaginatively of how government can do more but do better and work with the private sector in ways that aren't beholden to it and limited by it.
One more.
So I just want to ask one more question that I think is so helpful for how we think about the day, and that I'm Tony Irving, Executive Director of Get in Chicago. And these issues, one of the things that's so important about, I think, starting with housing is that we understand that there's multi-factors involved in the lives of driving young people into being in an acutely high-risk scenario. But when you think about the housing and the vouchers situation in particular, you mentioned 2,700 vouchers in South Shore. And when we look at the size and the footprint of South Shore, that's an extremely large amount of square footage reserved for concentrated poverty. And so what is the potential for a community like South Shore when there's 2,700 vouchers assigned to it? Conversely, we look at a very large community like Lincoln Park, and there's 54 vouchers assigned to it. That in the total number of 30,000 vouchers, over a third of them are in the 7 communities that Get in Chicago focuses on. So in a frame toward practical solutions, what recommendations would you make in the here and now to improve the diversification of these vouchers or to lessen some of the experiences that they create in terms of concentrated poverty?
Yeah, so you could think of sort of a twofold response to that. Thanks, Tony. So one is when I talked about how vouchers sort of still segregated the city, some of that had to do just with money, with dollars. That if the voucher, the amount of money you get the government can only afford a rent in South Shore and it can't afford rent in Lincoln Park, as you get $700, say, from the government, and rent in Lincoln Park is $2,500. You don't live there. And so you would have to, in one sense, increase the voucher amount. And then you run into, you could feel deep inside of people how they react to that, about what does it mean to be deserving. We, for a while, had something called super vouchers. It was nicknamed that, where families were moved into areas right around here. And when it leaked to the media, or was talked about, and leaked, it existed, so it was out there. But when it became a public thing, there was outcry. How could we give $3,000 to someone? And so it was taken away. The mayor, the city took them away immediately rather than sort of think about a creative way to continue it. So we bump up against our sense of, what it means. We know from studies and studies that dollars invested on the front end save money on the back end. So for stability, for housing, for healthcare, we know that they save money, but we're not willing to do that investment. I'd say the other flip side of that question is why would people from South Shore need to go to Lincoln Park? Do they really need Lincoln Park? Can't South Shore be also built up in a way that can be stable and full of resources? So I don't think it's just thinking about how we distribute people evenly. It's also where people reside and where they're around family members and friends, and how those communities are made safer, fuller, more livable. And that's a different kind of investment. When we think of, how vouchers are not the only, there are poor people everywhere and they're not necessarily receiving government aid. I said only 20%, so 80% of people who are impoverished are living in these communities as well. So there's a different investment there as well. Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.